This video is brought to you by Ground News. We've talked a lot about European strategic autonomy on this channel, but never in relation to the digital sphere. The truth is, the EU is enormously dependent on American and Chinese tech, undermining its digital autonomy and exposing it to potential disinformation and political interference. In the past few months, the battle between the EU and the US tech giants has flared up, with US Vice President JD Vance attacking the EU for its efforts to regulate online content, and the European Commission last month fined Apple €500 million and Meta €200 million over non-compliance with its Digital Markets Act. Some MEPs have therefore suggested that Europe should build its own alternative social media platforms, while other suggestions include funding existing European platforms like Mastodon to make them into a continent-wide public-private platform. So in this video, we'll look at the EU's digital sovereignty crisis and some of the arguments for and against the EU having its own social media. Who is the most influential person in the world? Well, with your help, we've put together a full ranking. Learn the top 10 in the video linked below, or pick up a copy of our magazine for the full list. Let's start with the EU's battle against the US tech firms. In 2022, the EU's Digital Markets Act, or DMA, was established to reduce the monopoly held by 6 so-called gatekeeper platforms: the US companies Alphabet, which owns Google and thereby YouTube, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, and Meta, which owns Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, plus the Chinese firm ByteDance, which owns TikTok. Alongside the DMA, the EU also established the Digital Services Act, or DSA, aimed at improving user safety, forcing companies to combat disinformation, label ads, and make it easier for users to report illegal content. Both pieces of legislation tackled concerns over the enormous and largely unchecked power that the US tech firms have across multiple jurisdictions. Just think about how many European governments use Facebook or Instagram for public communication, WhatsApp for internal comms, and the monopoly that Google holds over search. This all leaves the EU exposed to potential geopolitical coercion, for instance through platforms censoring pro-European content but promoting anti-EU, pro-US narratives to users. But what's really got the conversation going recently is Donald Trump. In early April, Trump announced a 20% tariff on imports from the EU, now reduced to 10% until the end of a 90-day negotiation period, prompting the EU to consider its retaliatory options, including a possible tax on digital advertising revenues that would hit X, Amazon, Google, and Facebook. However, the White House has signaled it would view a retaliation against its tech firms as a hostile act, having repeatedly portrayed the EU's efforts to monitor content online as censorship and criticized the EU's regulatory processes for stifling business. Trump's willingness to bring regulatory issues into trade negotiations limits the EU's ability to rein in big tech, and we've also seen this in the UK recently, where the government agreed not to increase its digital services tax on the US tech giants in order to secure a trade deal. Moreover, while some EU member states, like France, are keener on taking action against US tech, others, notably Germany, are wary, with Germany's finance minister Jörg Kukies noting that the EU has, quote, no real alternatives to the offering by the American digital industry. So this has all prompted questions about whether the EU should build its own social media platforms. There's been some chatter about this both among MEPs and Europeans on Reddit, so we thought we'd weigh up some of the pros and cons. We'll start with the arguments in favour. Firstly, if the EU had its own social media platforms, it could better monitor political content online and prevent election interference or disinformation from third parties. Ahead of Germany's 2025 federal election in February, a court ruled that Elon Musk's X must provide access to data on politically related content, as there were fears that it would push content promoting Musk's favoured far-right AfD party. Romania's ongoing political crisis was also sparked partly over concerns of Russian interference on social media, which could maybe have been prevented if the EU controlled its own platforms. Another argument in favour is that the US and China already effectively have their own social media bubbles, which leaves the EU out in the cold, as it has no way of controlling content on any major US or Chinese-owned platform. This also shapes European culture and arguably limits the EU's soft power, with social media trends and online culture massively influenced by the US and American influences. Finally, there's a precedent for publicly owned broadcast media, with many European governments funding national TV and radio stations, and a similar argument could be made for publicly owned European social media platforms, especially given that social media is growing as a news source for many people, and is now the main news source for 16 to 30-year-olds in the EU. Now for the arguments against. The main one is that the US platforms are better than any current European alternatives. They're less fragmented, easier to use, and the so-called network effects mean that once you've already got a base of millions of interconnected users, convincing that base to move to a different platform is very tricky. This is why, despite widespread condemnation of Musk's management of X and predictions of its death, European politicians continue to share updates and announcements on there. Another point is that, despite concerns over harmful content on American platforms, any engagement-driven algorithm will likely favour sensationalist or extremist content, as this tends to be more clickable. So it's not necessarily the case that a European alternative would be any less toxic or less susceptible to misinformation than the current US platforms. Indeed, it's even possible that a European social media platform could end up creating an EU echo chamber of some sort, which wouldn't be good for transatlantic dialogue or people trying to inform themselves about international news. Finally, it may simply be too difficult. Europe's digital industry is nowhere near as developed as the US is, especially when it comes to cybersecurity and AI. And Europe doesn't have the same startup culture as the US, which makes getting tech companies off the ground even harder. The fact that the EU is also effectively made up of 27 different markets, each with different populations and languages, also means that any media ecosystem will inevitably be fragmented. Whereas the US social media firms have access to 340 million Americans, plus another billion people around the world who speak English as a foreign language. The EU is apparently aware of this predicament too. According to a Bloomberg report from last month, a European Commission draft document concedes that the EU won't be able to break free from its reliance on US tech anytime soon, stating, "Decoupling is unrealistic and cooperation will remain significant." But whilst it doesn't look like we'll get European social media anytime soon, we are seeing EU member states increasing investment in AI, with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, for instance, formally establishing a new digital ministry last week, aimed at improving digital competitiveness and innovation. If the EU were to try to develop its own social media, its regulatory power could actually prove useful here, for example by mandating US platforms to interconnect with European alternatives. The EU could also introduce tax breaks for organisations and creators using European platforms to encourage growth. But for the foreseeable future, European digital sovereignty will probably remain a distant dream. This is a complex and nuanced story though, and there's plenty more to read about it online, with 105 sources reporting on it. The issue is, how can you be sure that what you're reading isn't hugely biased? Well, that's a problem we face when making these videos too, and luckily that's where this week's sponsor, Ground News, comes in. For this story on the EU considering taxes against big tech, they've identified at least 22 left-leaning and 15 right-leaning sources reporting on it. In fact, in addition to this, they've also shown the main differences in headlines among left-leaning and right-leaning outlets, with left-leaning outlets framing potential taxes on big tech as justified, and right-leaning outlets portraying them as targeted and aggressive. We're able to do that because of our sponsor Ground News, whose incredible website and app lets you discover the news and pull back the curtain on media bias. That's because every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organisations. But one of the best parts of their app is their blind spot feed. This presents you with stories and articles that haven't been reported on by one side of the aisle or the other, helping you better break out of your media bubble and discover what people on the other side of the political spectrum are really saying. This is all in addition to the bias distribution we mentioned earlier, and together these fantastic features help you to figure out exactly who's behind the stories you're reading and what agenda they may have. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape, and apps like this will probably only become more essential as the media landscape continues to evolve. If you're interested in everything Ground News has to offer, you can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan using the link in the description or by scanning the QR code. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.